Chapter 1: Commonwealths, Crimes, and Calamities. This is a tale of two peoples, British and American, who in the mid-1700s stood together on the cusp of history. They still saw themselves as one, proud Britons all. Yet in a few short years, the ocean between them would become an ever-widening and finally unbridgeable chasm. No one could have predicted that eventually, as 1763 opened, Great Britain was at the height of its powers, having finally won the 7 Years' War, which we in America call the French and Indian War. The British Empire was greater than any the West had known since the Rome's heyday, stretching from North America to the Indian subcontinent, the Far East, and Africa. It was a far-flung and poorly administered empire, but somehow, despite what one prime minister called a salutary neglect, it managed to hold together. Now, though, with the long war with France over, Britain's debts were huge, and it had even greater territory to administer. The 1763 Treaty of Paris more than doubled British America, giving it all of Canada and lands west of the Appalachian Mountains and east of the Mississippi, except New Orleans. Lands that had been claimed by Native Americans who weren't apt to give up their rights without a fight. One way to head off trouble with the Indians, Native Americans, was essentially to fence in the colonists and keep them from settling the native lands west of the Appalachians. To that end, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 banned Western migration. Unfortunately, some enterprising colonists found that their lands were on the wrong side of the proclamation line. They wanted to move further east. Among them was an ambitious young Virginian named George Washington, who had speculated on Western lands. Title: A New King in New Times. For the past 80 years, since the Glorious Revolution had ousted James II, the king's ministers had increasingly come to hold the reins of government. Still, all Britons, including Americans, revered their monarch. And in 1760, great public affection accompanied George III to the throne. He was only 22. But as long as power rested in more experienced hands, Britons thought all would be well. Still, young George felt a need to assert himself. He quickly got rid of the powerful and brilliant minister, William Pitt, and gave his own loyal Tory following prominent positions. Sounds familiar. They were doing their best to bring some logic to the governance of the empire. The American colonists would need to assume a little responsibility on their own instead of flaunting British authority, as they had done in recent decades. The obstreperous New Englanders had ignored the Molasses Act, which passed 30 years before, instead choosing to bribe Crown agents to look the other way as they imported molasses for their rum from the Indies. Sounds like the drug war. So in 1764, Parliament enacted a new tax to replace the Molasses Act, the Sugar Act. Parliament reasoned would be no more onerous to the colonists than the bribes that they were paying. The act also placed duties on other imports, such as coffee and wine, and it required that colonial timber, iron, and a few other goods be exported exclusively to the mother country. Americans howled in protest. The French and Indian War boom that had fueled a burgeoning consumerism and confidence had tailed off. And for 4 years, the American economy had been bleak. How could Parliament now enact taxes on the colonists when they had no representatives to speak on the behalf in that body? Taxes, after all, were a gift of the people to the government, voted on by legislators who represented the people. The New York General Assembly explained this in the official protest of Parliament over the Sugar Act. Quote, "An exemption from the burden of ungranted involuntary taxes must be the grand principle of every free state. Without such a right vested in themselves, exclusive of all others, there can be no liberty, no happiness, no security. It is inseparable from the very idea of property. For who can call that his own, which may be taken away at the pleasure of another? And indeed, colonists, unquote. And indeed, the colonists had become very attached to their property, something that in the New World they had the liberty to work for, to accrue, and to enjoy. 9 different colonial legislatures sent protests to Parliament. In the House of Commons, Charles Townshend expressed a general reaction. Quote, and now will these Americans, children planted by our care, nourished up by our indulgence, until they are grown to a degree of strength and opulence, and protected by our arms, will they grudge to contribute their might to relieve us from a heavy weight of that burden which we lie under, unquote. Colonel Isaac Barre, a veteran of the French and Indian War, rose in America's defense. Quote, they planted by your care? No, your oppressions planted them in America. They fled from your tyranny to a then uncultivated and unhospitable country, where they expose themselves to almost all the hardships to which human nature is liable. So that same spirit which actuated that people at first will accompany them still. Barre's precedent outburst fell on deaf ears.